Sergeant Daniel Morrison stood at his post outside Westminster Palace on a bright Tuesday morning, his red ceremonial uniform perfectly pressed and his black boots polished to mere brightness. At 26 years old, Daniel had been serving as a royal guard for 4 years and had never missed a day of duty. His tall frame and strong shoulders carried the weight of his ceremonial rifle with practiced ease, and his blue eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon as required by military protocol. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of London coming to life around him. Tourists were already beginning to gather for photographs, their excited chatter creating a cheerful backdrop to his silent vigil. Daniel had learned to tune out most distractions during his years of service, but he still enjoyed listening to the different languages and accents of visitors from around the world who came to see the famous guards in their traditional uniforms. Today felt special to Daniel, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was because his girlfriend Sarah had agreed to marry him just 3 days earlier. Or maybe it was the letter he had received from his younger sister, announcing that she had been accepted to medical school. Life seemed to be aligning perfectly for the young soldier who had dedicated himself to serving his country with honor and distinction. Daniel's thoughts drifted briefly to the small apartment he shared with Sarah near the barracks, where they were planning their wedding for the following spring. Sarah worked as a primary school teacher and understood the demands of Daniel's military career, supporting him through long hours of training and ceremonial duties that kept him away from home for extended periods. The engagement ring had cost Daniel 3 months of salary, but seeing Sarah's face light up when he proposed had made every penny worthwhile. They had met 2 years earlier at a charity event, where Daniel was representing the Royal Guards, and Sarah had been volunteering to help organize activities for disadvantaged children. Her kindness and genuine warmth had attracted him immediately, and their relationship had grown stronger through shared values of service and dedication to others. Standing at his post, Daniel maintained the perfect posture that had been drilled into him during months of intensive training. His chin was level, his shoulders were square, and his breathing was controlled and steady. The weight of his ceremonial uniform, including the heavy bearskin hat that added 6 inches to his height, no longer bothered him after years of practice. He had learned to stand motionless for hours at a time, ignoring physical discomfort and mental fatigue, while remaining constantly alert for any security concerns. The tourist crowd was beginning to grow larger as the morning progressed, with families positioning themselves for photographs and tour groups gathering to hear explanations about the history and significance of the Royal Guards. Daniel could see children pointing at him with excitement, their parents explaining the important job that the soldiers performed in protecting the royal family and maintaining centuries-old traditions. A group of school children from France had gathered nearby with their teacher, who was explaining in French how the guards were selected and trained for their prestigious positions. Daniel understood enough French to follow the conversation, and he was pleased to hear the teacher emphasizing the discipline, dedication, and honor required to earn the right to wear the famous red uniform. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming Daniel's face. Despite the cool October air, he could feel the familiar comfort of routine settling around him like a well-worn coat. This was his world, his purpose, and his contribution to something larger than himself. Every day that he stood guard was another day of service to his country and its people, another link in the chain of tradition that connected him to centuries of soldiers who had stood at similar posts. Daniel's radio earpiece crackled softly with routine communications from the security command center, confirming that all posts were secure and that the day's schedule was proceeding normally. He acknowledged the transmission with an almost imperceptible nod, the kind of subtle response that maintained protocol while keeping him connected to the broader security network responsible for protecting the government buildings and officials in the Westminster area. The street in front of Daniel's post was busy with the usual mix of pedestrians, tourists, and local traffic that characterized central London during the morning hours. Black cabs moved steadily through the designated lanes, their drivers expert at navigating around the double-decker buses that carried sightseers from attraction to attraction. Cyclists weaved between the larger vehicles, most of them commuters heading to office jobs in the financial district or government workers traveling between meetings. Daniel had become familiar with the rhythm and patterns of the street traffic during his years of service. He knew the approximate times when the morning rush would peak, when the tourist buses would arrive, when the afternoon shift changes would bring new crowds of visitors to see the guards. This predictability was comforting, providing a steady framework within which he could perform his duties, while staying alert for anything unusual or potentially threatening. The sound of bicycle bells and motorcycle engines had become part of the background noise that Daniel automatically filtered out while maintaining his focus on potential security concerns. London's streets were filled with cyclists of all types, from serious commuters in professional attire to casual tourists exploring the city on rented bikes. Most cyclists were careful and respectful around the guard posts, understanding that they were entering areas with heightened security awareness. As the morning wore on, Daniel felt the quiet satisfaction that came from performing his duties well. His uniform remained crisp and perfect, his posture was exemplary, and his attention was properly focused on his responsibilities. This was shaping up to be another successful day of service. Another small contribution to the larger mission of protecting the institutions and values that defined British society. The tourists continued to gather and take photographs, their happiness and excitement creating a positive energy that Daniel could sense even while maintaining his formal composure. Children waved at him hopefully, parents pointed out details of his uniform and equipment, and elderly visitors often paused to observe his discipline and dedication with obvious respect and appreciation. What Daniel couldn't know was that this perfect morning was about to be shattered by an event that would test not only his physical courage but also his capacity for forgiveness, compassion, and understanding in ways that no military training could have prepared him for. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the peaceful morning at Westminster Palace was shattered by an event that would change multiple lives forever. A young man named Marcus Chen, 23 years old, and working as a bicycle courier in central London, was rushing to deliver an urgent legal document to a law firm near Parliament when everything went horribly wrong. Marcus had been cycling professionally for 8 months, using his bike to earn money while studying computer programming at evening classes. The job paid well enough to cover his rent and school fees, and he enjoyed the freedom of moving through London streets while getting exercise and fresh air. He was known among his colleagues for being careful and responsible, always wearing his helmet and following traffic rules even when running late for deliveries. This morning was different, though. Marcus had overslept after staying up late studying for an important exam. He was already running 30 minutes behind on his delivery schedule. His supervisor had called twice to emphasize how crucial this particular delivery was, explaining that the legal documents were needed for a court hearing that afternoon. The stress of potentially losing his job was making Marcus push harder than usual, taking risks he would normally avoid. As Marcus rounded the corner approaching Daniel's guard post, he was focused entirely on checking his GPS to confirm the address of his destination. The small screen of his phone showed that he needed to turn right at the next intersection, and he was calculating whether he could still make the delivery on time if he maintained his current speed through the busy streets. What Marcus didn't see was the group of tourists who had suddenly moved into the street to get a better angle for photographs of the Royal Guard. A family from Japan was trying to capture the perfect shot of their children standing near Daniel's post, and they had inadvertently blocked the bicycle lane that Marcus was using to navigate through the congested traffic. The chain of events that followed happened in less than 3 seconds, but the consequences would last for years. Marcus, glancing up from his phone just in time to see the blocked path ahead, swerved hard to the left to avoid colliding with the tourists. His sudden change of direction sent him directly into the path of a black taxi that was changing lanes, forcing the cab driver to brake hard and horn loudly. The taxi's sudden stop created a domino effect of braking vehicles behind it, and Marcus found himself trapped between the stopped cab and a double-decker bus that was pulling up to the curb. With nowhere else to go and his bike's momentum still carrying him forward, Marcus was forced to swerve again. This time, toward the sidewalk where Daniel stood at his ceremonial post. Marcus tried desperately to control his bike as it mounted the curb. But the combination of his speed, the angle of approach, and the wet leaves that had fallen from the trees created conditions that made a crash inevitable. He could see the royal guard directly ahead and tried to brake, but his bike's wheels skidded on the slippery surface, sending him sliding sideways toward Daniel's position. Daniel, who had been maintaining his ceremonial focus on the distant horizon, became aware of the approaching danger only in the final second before impact. His peripheral vision caught the flash of movement as Marcus and his bicycle came sliding toward him. But his formal position and the weight of his ceremonial uniform made it impossible for him to move quickly enough to avoid the collision. The impact was tremendous. Marcus and his bicycle struck Daniel at full force, sending both young men tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs, military equipment, and twisted metal. Daniel's ceremonial rifle clattered across the pavement, his bearskin hat flew off his head, and his perfect uniform was instantly torn and stained with dirt and blood. The sound of the collision was sickening, the crunch of metal against bone, the heavy thud of bodies hitting concrete, and the sharp cry of pain that escaped from both men as they hit the ground hard. The cheerful sounds of the mourning crowd were instantly replaced by gasps of horror, screams from witnesses, and the urgent shouts of people calling for medical assistance. Daniel felt immediate, intense pain shooting through his left leg where Marcus's bicycle had struck him, and he could taste blood in his mouth from biting his tongue during the fall. His vision was blurred and his head was spinning. But his military training kept him conscious and aware of his surroundings, even as shock began to set in from the trauma of the accident. Marcus was in even worse condition. The impact had thrown him over his bicycle's handlebars, and he had landed hard on his right shoulder and arm. He could feel that something was seriously wrong with his collarbone, and the sharp pain in his ribs suggested that he might have broken bones there as well. Blood was flowing from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the pavement, and he was struggling to breathe normally. The crowd of tourists who had been peacefully taking photographs moments earlier were now in a state of shock and panic. Some people were calling emergency services on their phones. Others were taking photos and videos of the accident scene, and a few were trying to approach the injured men to offer assistance. The Japanese family, whose movement had triggered the chain of events, were crying and repeatedly apologizing, though neither Daniel nor Marcus was in any condition to understand what had happened. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with emergency responders. Paramedics arrived first, quickly assessing both men's injuries and beginning immediate treatment. Police officers secured the area and began interviewing witnesses to understand how the accident had occurred. Additional royal guards were summoned to maintain security around the palace while Daniel received medical attention. Daniel, despite his own pain and confusion, found himself looking at the young cyclist who had collided with him. He could see that Marcus was badly injured and clearly distressed about what had happened. Even through the haze of his own trauma, Daniel's training and natural compassion made him more concerned about the other young man's condition than his own injuries. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked one of the paramedics who was examining his leg, his voice weak but filled with genuine concern for Marcus's well-being. "Please make sure he gets help first. I can see he's hurt badly." The paramedic was amazed by Daniel's selflessness in the immediate aftermath of such a traumatic accident. Most people in his situation would be focused entirely on their own pain and injuries, but this young soldier's first concern was for the person who had accidentally caused his suffering. Marcus, semi-conscious and drifting in and out of awareness, heard Daniel's words and felt a crushing weight of guilt and remorse settle over him like a heavy blanket. Through his pain and confusion, he understood that he had seriously injured someone who was just doing his job. Someone who was now showing concern for his welfare despite being the victim of Marcus's mistake. As the paramedics prepared both men for transport to the hospital, neither Daniel nor Marcus could have imagined how this terrible accident would ultimately lead to one of the most beautiful examples of human forgiveness and friendship that anyone involved would ever witness. The ambulance ride to St. Thomas Hospital was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and urgent medical conversations that Daniel could barely follow through the haze of pain medication and shock. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of radio communications between the paramedics and the hospital emergency department as they prepared for the arrival of two trauma patients from the Westminster incident. Daniel's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. X-rays revealed a fractured tibia in his left leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion that would require careful monitoring over the next several days. The doctors explained to him that the leg injury would require surgery to properly set the broken bone, and that his recovery would likely take several months of physical therapy before he could return to active duty. In the bed next to Daniels in the emergency department, Marcus Chen was receiving treatment for injuries that were considerably more severe. The impact with the Royal Guard and the subsequent fall onto concrete had resulted in a broken collarbone, 2 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a serious concussion that had left him unconscious for nearly 20 minutes after the accident. As Daniel became more alert and aware of his surroundings, he could hear the medical team working on Marcus and discussing the extent of his injuries. The young cyclist's condition was stable, but serious, and the doctors were particularly concerned about the head injury that had knocked him unconscious. For such an extended period, "Doctor, how's the other patient doing?" Daniel asked Dr. Jennifer Williams, the orthopedic surgeon who was preparing to operate on his fractured leg. Despite his own pain and the stress of learning about his injuries, Daniel's first concern remained the well-being of the young man who had accidentally caused the lision. Dr. Williams was struck by Daniel's selfless concern for Marcus, especially given the severity of his own injuries and the traumatic nature of the accident. "He's stable now, but his injuries are quite serious. The head trauma is our main concern, though the early signs are encouraging. You should focus on your own recovery right now." When Marcus finally regained consciousness several hours later, his first coherent words were questions about the condition of the Royal Guard he had struck. The guilt and remorse he felt were overwhelming. Made even worse by the physical pain from his multiple injuries and the disorientation caused by his concussion, "The soldier I hit," Marcus whispered to the nurse who was checking his vital signs. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's going to be all right. I can't live with myself if I've seriously hurt him." Nurse Patricia Collins had been working in emergency medicine for 15 years and had seen countless accident victims struggle with guilt and trauma after injuring others. She recognized the deep distress in Marcus's voice and understood that his emotional pain might be even more severe than his physical injuries. "Oh, the Royal Guard is stable and receiving excellent care," Nurse Collins assured Marcus gently. "His injuries are serious but treatable, and the doctors expect him to make a full recovery. Right now, you need to focus on healing yourself so that you can eventually make things right with him." Both young men spent their first night in the hospital thinking about each other rather than their own pain and challenges. Daniel lay awake despite his pain medication, worrying about the cyclist who had seemed so badly injured and wondering about the circumstances that had led to the accident. Marcus stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, replaying the collision over and over in his mind and struggling with guilt that felt heavier than all his physical injuries combined. The next morning brought visitors for both patients. Daniel's fiancée, Sarah, arrived early, her face showing the stress and worry she had experienced since receiving the phone call about his accident. She had driven through the night from her teaching job in Brighton, arriving at the hospital just as visiting hours began. "Daniel," Sarah whispered as she saw him lying in the hospital bed, his leg elevated and surrounded by medical equipment. "When I got the call about the accident, I was so terrified that I might lose you. Are you in much pain? Do the doctors think you'll be able to return to duty?" Daniel took Sarah's hand and squeezed it gently, drawing comfort from her presence despite his physical discomfort. "I'll be fine, love. The doctors say the recovery will take several months, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage. I'm more worried about the young man who hit me. From what I could see, his injuries looked worse than mine." Sarah was amazed by Daniel's compassion and lack of anger toward the person who had caused his injuries. She knew that his military career meant everything to him, and that being unable to serve would be emotionally devastating. Yet his first concern was still for the welfare of the cyclist who had accidentally ended his active duty. Meanwhile, Marcus was receiving a visit from his older sister Lisa, who had flown in from Manchester as soon as she learned about the accident. Lisa worked as a social worker and was familiar with trauma counseling, but she had never seen her normally confident younger brother so consumed with guilt and self-recrimination. "Marcus, you have to understand that this was an accident," Lisa said, holding her brother's uninjured hand. "You didn't set out to hurt anyone. You were trying to avoid hitting those tourists, and you got caught in an impossible situation with nowhere to go. You can't destroy yourself with guilt over something that wasn't intentional." Marcus shook his head weakly, tears streaming down his face. "But I was looking at my phone, Lisa. I was distracted and running late. Because of my carelessness, I've seriously injured a soldier who was just doing his job. He was standing there protecting people. And I crashed into him like some kind of reckless idiot." The conversation was overheard by Dr. Williams, who was making her rounds and checking on both patients before Daniel's surgery. She'd been thinking about the unusual dynamic between these two young men, both of whom seemed more concerned about each other's well-being than their own injuries. "Excuse me?" Dr. Williams said to Lisa, "But I couldn't help overhearing your brother's concerns about the other patient. Would it help to know that the Royal Guard has been asking about your brother's condition?" Both of these young men seemed to be more worried about each other than themselves, which is quite remarkable given the circumstances. Lisa looked at the doctor with surprise, then back at her brother, whose face showed a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "The soldier is asking about Marcus. Even after what happened to him?" Dr. Williams nodded. "It's quite extraordinary, actually. In my experience, accident victims are usually focused on their own recovery and often harbor resentment toward those who caused their injuries. But both of these patients have shown nothing but concern for each other's well-being. It's one of the most moving examples of human compassion I've encountered in my medical career." The information that Daniel was inquiring about his condition gave Marcus the first small measure of comfort he had felt since the accident, the possibility that the Royal Guard might not hate him for what had happened offered a tiny ray of hope in what had been an ocean of guilt and despair. As the day progressed and both young men prepared for their respective surgeries, the medical staff began to recognize that they were witnessing something special. The mutual concern and lack of animosity between these two patients was creating an atmosphere of healing and hope that extended far beyond their physical injuries. Neither Daniel nor Marcus yet knew that their paths would cross again in ways that would transform both of their lives and provide an inspiring example of forgiveness, friendship, and the power of human compassion to overcome even the most traumatic circumstances. 3 days after their surgeries, Dr. Jennifer Williams made a decision that would surprise both her patients and create one of the most emotionally powerful moments that the hospital staff had ever witnessed. After observing both Daniel and Marcus struggling with worry about each other's condition, she decided that a carefully managed meeting between the two young men might help both of them begin the emotional healing process that was just as important as their physical recovery. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Williams said as she entered Daniel's room during her morning rounds, "I have an unusual request to discuss with you. The young cyclist who was involved in your accident has been asking about your condition constantly, and frankly, his guilt and distress are hampering his recovery. I'm wondering if you might be willing to meet with him briefly under careful medical supervision, so that both of you can see that the other is healing." Daniel's immediate response was enthusiastic agreement. Despite Sarah's concerns about the emotional stress such a meeting might cause, "Doctor, I've been hoping for the chance to speak with him," Daniel said, his voice strong despite his physical discomfort. "I want him to know that I don't blame him for what happened and that I'm genuinely concerned about his recovery. If seeing me will help him heal, then I'm absolutely willing to meet with him." Dr. Williams then approached Marcus with the same proposal, finding him in a state of anxious depression that was clearly affecting his physical healing process. The young cyclist had been refusing visits from friends and had barely been eating, consumed with guilt about the injuries he had caused to an innocent person who had been serving his country. "Marcus, I want to suggest something that might seem difficult, but could help both you and the other patient begin to heal emotionally." Dr. Williams explained gently, "The Royal Guard has asked to meet with you. He wants you to know that he doesn't hold you responsible for the accident. And he's genuinely concerned about your recovery. Would you be willing to see him? Marcus's first reaction was fear and shame. The thought of facing the man he had injured was terrifying. But it was also something he knew he needed to do if he was ever going to find peace with what had happened. I don't know if I deserve his forgiveness, Marcus whispered, but I need to apologize to him face to face. If he's willing to see me, then yes, I want to meet with him. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Kay was in a quiet conference room adjacent to the hospital's physical therapy department. Both men were transported in wheelchairs, with medical staff standing by to monitor their conditions and provide support if the emotional stress became overwhelming for either patient. When Daniel first saw Marcus being wheeled into the room, his immediate reaction was compassion rather than anger or resentment. The young cyclist looked pale and fragile, visible bruising on his face and his right arm in a complicated sling that immobilized his injured shoulder and collarbone. The guilt and pain in Marcus's eyes were obvious and heartbreaking to witness. "Hello, Marcus," Daniel said gently. Having learned the cyclist's name from Dr. Williams, "I'm Daniel Morrison. I want you to know that I'm glad you're recovering. I've been worried about how you've been handling all of this emotionally." Marcus looked up at Daniel with tears already forming in his eyes. Seeing the Royal Guard in person, his leg in a cast and his face still showing signs of their collision, made the reality of what had happened even more devastating. "I'm so sorry," Marcus began, his voice breaking with emotion. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for what I did to you. I was distracted and careless, and because of my mistakes, I've destroyed your career and caused you so much pain." Daniel reached out from his wheelchair and took Marcus's uninjured hand in both of his. The gesture was so unexpected and filled with such genuine warmth that it left Marcus stunned and unable to continue speaking. "Marcus, what happened was an accident," Daniel said firmly but kindly. "You weren't trying to hurt anyone. You were trying to avoid hitting those tourists, and you got caught in an impossible situation. I don't blame you for what happened. I don't want you to destroy yourself with guilt over something that wasn't intentional." The words were almost identical to what Marcus's sister had said to him, but hearing them from Daniel himself had a completely different impact. The forgiveness and understanding in the Royal Guard's voice were genuine and immediate, offered without conditions or reservations. It was the kind of grace that Marcus had never experienced before and had never imagined he might receive from someone he had injured so. "Seriously, but your career," Marcus protested weakly. "The doctors told me that your injuries might prevent you from returning to active duty. I've ruined everything you worked for. Everything that was important to you." Daniel smiled sadly, acknowledging the truth of Marcus's concern while maintaining his compassionate perspective. "My career is important to me, that's true. But it's not the most important thing in my life. My fiancé, my family, my friends, those are the things that really matter. And if this accident has taught me anything, it's that holding on to anger and resentment would only make both of our lives worse. Forgiveness isn't just a gift I'm giving to you, Marcus. It's a gift I'm giving to myself." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both young men sharing their perspectives on the accident and their hopes for recovery. Marcus learned about Daniel's upcoming wedding and his concerns about how the injuries might affect his future plans. Daniel learned about Marcus's studies, his dreams of becoming a computer programmer, and the financial pressures that had led him to take risks while working as a bicycle courier, Dr. Williams. And the nursing staff who observed the meeting were deeply moved by what they witnessed, instead of the anger, blame, and recrimination they might have expected. They saw two young men connecting as human beings, offering each other support and understanding in the face of shared trauma and uncertainty. "You know what the strangest part is?" Daniel said near the end of their meeting, "I keep thinking that maybe this accident happened for a reason. Not that either of us deserved to get hurt. But maybe we were meant to meet each other and learn something about forgiveness and friendship that we couldn't have learned any other way." Marcus nodded through his tears, feeling a sense of peace beginning to replace the crushing guilt that had consumed him since the accident. "I want to find a way to make this right with you somehow," he said. "I don't know how yet. But I want to do something meaningful to show you how grateful I am for your forgiveness." Daniel squeezed Marcus's hand one more time before they were wheeled back to their respective rooms. Just focus on getting better, Marcus. Take care of yourself and work toward your dreams of becoming a programmer. That's the best way you can honor what happened between us today. As the two young men parted ways that afternoon, both of them felt a fundamental shift in their emotional state. The meeting had begun a healing process that would prove to be just as important as their physical recovery, and it had planted the seeds of a friendship that would grow stronger and more meaningful over time. The hospital staff who witnessed their interaction that day would talk about it for years afterward, describing it as one of the most beautiful examples of human forgiveness and compassion they had ever seen. It was proof that even in the aftermath of trauma and pain, people could choose grace over bitterness and understanding over anger, creating something beautiful from something that had begun in tragedy. The meeting between Daniel and Marcus marked the beginning of an extraordinary friendship that would surprise everyone who knew them, including themselves. Over the following weeks, as both young men progressed through their recovery and rehabilitation, they found themselves drawn to each other's company in ways that transcended the traumatic circumstances of their first encounter. What started as brief, supervised visits to check on each other's progress gradually evolved into daily conversations that became the highlight of both men's hospital stays. They discovered that, despite their very different backgrounds and life experiences, they shared common values, similar senses of humor, and a mutual respect that grew stronger with each interaction. Daniel learned that Marcus had grown up in a working-class family in East London. The son of Chinese immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children better opportunities than they had experienced. Marcus's father worked double shifts in a restaurant kitchen while his mother cleaned office buildings at night. Both of them determined that their son would have the education and chances they had never been offered. Marcus, in turn, learned about Daniel's upbringing in a military family, where service to country and community had been instilled from an early age. Daniel's father had been a career Army officer, and his mother had worked as a nurse on various military bases around the world. The values of duty, honor, and sacrifice had shaped Daniel's character, just as Marcus had been shaped by his parents. Work ethic and determination to succeed despite difficult circumstances, their daily conversations during recovery became something both men looked forward to with genuine enthusiasm. Daniel would share stories about his military training, his duties as a Royal Guard, and his upcoming wedding plans with Sarah. Marcus would talk about his computer programming studies, his dreams of starting his own software company, and his experiences working as a bicycle courier through London's busy streets. You know what's strange? Daniel said during one of their afternoon visits while they sat in the hospital's rehabilitation garden. Before the accident, I never really thought about what it would be like to pursue a completely different career. Being a soldier was all I ever wanted to do. But talking with you about programming and technology has opened my mind too. Possibilities I never considered. Marcus was amazed by Daniel's openness. 2 new ideas and his lack of bitterness about the potential end of his military career. I keep thinking about how you've handled this entire situation, Marcus replied. If someone had destroyed my dreams the way I destroyed yours, I don't think I could be as forgiving and positive as you've been. You've taught me more about character and grace than anyone I've ever met. There. Friendship deepened when Marcus learned that Daniel's wedding to Sarah would have to be postponed due to his injuries and the extended recovery period required before he could return to active duty. The financial stress of medical expenses and reduced income was creating additional challenges for the couple, who had been saving carefully for their dream ceremony. I want to help with your wedding expenses, Marcus announced one day, catching Daniel completely off guard. I know it's not much, but I've been saving money for my courier work, and I want to contribute something toward making your special day happen when you're ready for it. Daniel was deeply touched by the offer, but initially refused to accept any financial help from Marcus. You're dealing with your own medical expenses and lost income from being unable to work, Daniel protested. I can't let you sacrifice your savings for our wedding, Marcus persisted, explaining that being able to do something positive and meaningful for Daniel was important to his own emotional healing process. Please let me do this, he said earnestly. You've given me forgiveness and friendship when you had every right to be angry and resentful. This is the only way I can think of to show you how much that means to me." Eventually, Daniel agreed to accept Marcus's contribution, but only on the condition that Marcus would be invited to attend the wedding as an honored guest. The idea of having the young cyclist who had accidentally changed his life present at one of his most important moments felt right and meaningful to both men. Sarah, who had initially been skeptical about Daniel's relationship with Marcus, gradually came to understand and appreciate the genuine friendship that had developed between them. When she met Marcus for the first time during one of her visits to the hospital, she was struck by his sincerity, his obvious remorse about the accident, and his genuine affection for her fiancé. "I was prepared not to like you," Sarah admitted to Marcus with characteristic honesty during their first conversation. "I was angry about Daniel's injuries and the disruption to our plans. But seeing how much your friendship means to him and witnessing the positive effect you've had on his recovery has changed my perspective completely." Marcus's own family was initially puzzled by his deep emotional investment in the welfare of the man he had accidentally injured. But they too came to recognize that the friendship was providing healing and purpose for their son that extended far beyond physical recovery. His sister Lisa was particularly impressed by the change she saw in Marcus's attitude and outlook. "When I first visited you in the hospital, I was terrified that the guilt and trauma would permanently damage your spirit," Lisa told Marcus. "But this friendship with Daniel has transformed you in ways I never expected. You're stronger, more confident, and more at peace than I've seen you in years." The medical staff at St. Thomas Hospital began using Daniel and Marcus's relationship as an example of how emotional healing could accelerate physical recovery. Both men progressed through their rehabilitation programs faster than expected, motivated by their desire to support each other and by the positive energy generated by their unusual friendship. Dr. Williams, who had arranged their initial meeting, was amazed by the results of her decision. "In 30 years of practicing medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this," she told her colleagues. "These two patients have created something beautiful and healing from what began as a tragic accident. Their friendship has become an inspiration to everyone who works with them." As both men prepared for discharge from the hospital, they made plans to continue their friendship beyond their recovery period. Marcus had decided to visit Daniel and Sarah regularly, while Daniel expressed interest in learning more about computer programming and possibly exploring technology-related career opportunities if his military service was permanently ended. Their bond had been forged in trauma, but strengthened by mutual respect, genuine care, and a shared recognition that sometimes the most meaningful relationships emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The accident that could have created lasting resentment and bitterness had instead produced a friendship that would enrich both of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. What neither of them knew was that their story of forgiveness and friendship was about to inspire many other people and demonstrate the power of human compassion to transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth and connection. A local journalist named Rebecca Matthews had heard about their unusual friendship from one of the hospital staff members and approached both men about sharing their story with a wider audience. Initially, both Daniel and Marcus were hesitant about publicity, preferring to keep their relationship private and focused on their personal healing and growth. "I'm not sure we want this to become a media story," Daniel said when Rebecca first contacted them. "What happened between Marcus and me feels very personal, and we don't want it to be sensationalized or turned into something it isn't." Marcus agreed with Daniel's concerns about privacy, but he also recognized that their story might help other people who were struggling with guilt, forgiveness, or the aftermath of traumatic accidents. Maybe if people see that it's possible to find friendship and healing even after something terrible happens, it could give hope to others in similar situations. After much discussion, both men agreed to share their story, but only if they could control how it was presented and ensure that the focus remained on the positive messages of forgiveness, resilience, and the possibility of finding good in difficult circumstances. An article that Rebecca Matthews wrote about their friendship was published in the London Evening standard and quickly gained national attention. The story struck a chord with readers who were moved by the example of two young men who had chosen compassion over anger, understanding over blame, and friendship over resentment in the aftermath of a traumatic accident. Letters and emails poured in from people around the world who had been touched by their story. Parents whose children had been involved in accidents wrote to thank Daniel and Marcus for showing that forgiveness was possible. Young people dealing with guilt and trauma found hope in their example of healing and growth. Military personnel and their families were inspired by Daniel's grace and resilience in the face of career-threatening injuries. One letter particularly moved both men. It came from a teenage driver who had been involved in a car accident that injured a pedestrian, and who had been considering suicide due to overwhelming guilt and depression. Reading about Daniel and Marcus's friendship had given him hope that healing and redemption were possible, and he had decided to seek counseling instead of ending his life. When I read that letter, I realized that sharing our story was absolutely the right decision, Marcus told Daniel. If our experience can save even one person from despair, then everything we went through was worthwhile. The publicity also brought unexpected opportunities for both men. A technology company in London offered Marcus an internship that would allow him to continue his studies while gaining practical experience in software development. A veterans organization approached Daniel about becoming a spokesperson for wounded service members, helping others navigate the challenges of recovery and potential career transitions. Their friendship continued to deepen as they supported each other through the ongoing challenges, recovery, and adaptation to their changed circumstances. Daniel's leg healed well enough for him to walk normally. Though he would never be able to return to active duty as a Royal Guard, instead of viewing this as a loss, he began to see it as an opportunity to explore new paths and discover abilities he hadn't known he possessed. Marcus's physical recovery was also progressing well, though he still experienced occasional pain in his shoulder and ribs that reminded him daily of their accident. Rather than dwelling on the physical discomfort, he chose to view these moments as reminders of the friendship and personal growth that had emerged from their traumatic encounter. As Daniel's discharge date approached, both men felt a mixture of excitement about returning to their normal lives and sadness about ending this unique chapter of their friendship that had developed. During their hospital stays, they made plans for Marcus to visit Daniel and Sarah regularly, and Daniel expressed serious interest in learning programming skills from Marcus. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually grateful for what happened to us," Daniel said during one of their final conversations in the hospital. "Not grateful for the pain or the injuries, but grateful for the friendship and the lessons about forgiveness and resilience that came from it. You've changed my life in ways that have nothing to do with the accident itself." Marcus nodded, feeling the same mixture of gratitude and amazement at how their relationship had developed. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that crashing into a Royal Guard would lead to the best friendship of my life, I would have thought they were crazy. But here we are, and I can't imagine my life without having you as a friend. Their story had become a powerful reminder that even in the midst of trauma and difficulty, human beings have the capacity to choose love over hate, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. The friendship between Daniel Morrison and Marcus Chen would continue to inspire others long after their physical injuries had healed, proving that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the most unexpected beginnings. 2 years after the accident that had changed their lives forever, Daniel Morrison and Marcus Chen stood together in the garden of Daniel and Sarah's new home, preparing to celebrate not just Daniel's wedding day, but also the launch of an organization that would help other people find healing and hope in the aftermath of traumatic accidents. Daniel's recovery had exceeded all medical expectations. Though he had officially retired from active military duty due to the long-term effects of his leg injury, instead of viewing this as an ending, he had embraced it as a new beginning. Using his military leadership skills to establish the Second Chances Foundation with Marcus as his co-founder and technology director, the foundation's mission was to connect accident victims with each other, providing support, counseling, practical assistance to both those who had been injured and those who had accidentally caused harm to others. Their own friendship had become the model, for what was possible when people chose forgiveness and understanding over anger and blame, Marcus had completed his computer programming degree with honors and had used his skills to create an innovative online platform that connected people dealing with similar trauma experiences. The platform allowed users to share their stories, find support groups, and access resources for emotional and practical recovery. Within its first year of operation, the platform had helped thousands of people around the world. I still can't believe how much our lives have changed since that morning at Westminster, Daniel said to Marcus as they watched the wedding guests arriving in the garden. Sarah looked radiant in her wedding dress, and the joy on her face made it clear that the delayed ceremony had been worth waiting for. Marcus, who had been asked to serve as one of Daniel's groomsmen, adjusted his tie nervously as he prepared to fulfill his role in the wedding ceremony. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if we had chosen anger and blame instead of friendship and forgiveness. Both of our lives would have been so much smaller and sadder. The wedding guest list included an extraordinary mix of people whose lives had been touched by Daniel and Marcus's story. There were fellow veterans, hospital staff members who had witnessed their friendship develop, journalists who had written about their experience, and dozens of people who had reached out to them after reading their story and finding hope for their own situations. Among the guests was 17-year-old Jake Morrison, no relation to Daniel, who had been the teenage driver contemplating suicide after his own accident. He had written to Daniel and Marcus 2 years earlier, and their response had led to ongoing mentorship that had helped him overcome his guilt and depression. Jake was now studying to become a counselor himself, hoping to help other young people facing similar challenges. Also present was Dr. Jennifer Williams, the orthopedic surgeon who had made the decision to arrange Daniel and Marcus's first meeting in the hospital. She had become a close friend and advisor to both men, and she often spoke at medical conferences about the importance of addressing emotional healing alongside physical recovery in trauma cases. Colonel Patricia Whitmore, Daniel's former commanding officer, had traveled from Scotland to attend the wedding. She had initially been concerned about Daniel's friendship with the cyclist who had ended his military career, but she had come to recognize that their relationship represented the very best values of service, sacrifice, and compassion that the military sought to instill in its personnel. Sergeant Morrison, Colonel Whitmore said as she congratulated Daniel before the ceremony, I want you to know that your actions since the accident have brought more honor to the uniform than any ceremonial duty you ever performed. You've shown that true service continues even after active duty ends. The wedding ceremony itself was a celebration not just of Daniel and Sarah's love, but also of the power of human resilience and the beauty that could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Marcus delivered a reading about friendship and forgiveness that brought tears to many of the guests' eyes, while Daniel's wedding vows included a promise to continue using their experience to help others find hope and healing. During the reception, Daniel and Marcus took a moment to step away from the celebration and reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. The physical scars from their accident had faded, but the emotional and spiritual growth they had experienced continued to influence every aspect of their lives. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met? Marcus asked as they stood quietly in a corner of the garden, watching the wedding guests dance and celebrate. Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. I think we both would have lived perfectly adequate lives, but they would have been so much less meaningful and connected than what we have now. The accident was terrible, but what came from it has been extraordinary. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who approached them with a photographer who wanted to capture a picture of the two men whose friendship had inspired so many others. As they posed together, both Daniel and Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path their lives had taken. The Second Chances Foundation had grown rapidly beyond their initial expectations, with chapters opening in 12 countries and partnerships developing with hospitals, counseling centers, and victim advocacy organizations worldwide. Their model of connecting people through shared experiences of trauma and recovery was being studied by psychologists and social workers as a new approach to healing. Marcus had also launched a successful software development company that specialized in creating applications for nonprofit organizations and social causes. His first major contract had been with the Second Chances Foundation, but his company now worked with dozens of charities and advocacy groups. Using technology to amplify their positive impact on society, Daniel had found his calling as a speaker and counselor, traveling around the world to share their story and help other people discover the possibility of finding meaning and connection in the aftermath of trauma. His military training in leadership and service had translated perfectly to his new career in helping others navigate difficult circumstances with grace and resilience. As the evening wound down and the wedding guests began to depart, Daniel and Marcus made plans for the following week when they would travel together to Manchester to speak at a conference for emergency room personnel about the importance of addressing emotional healing alongside medical treatment. "You know what the best part of all this has been?" Sarah said as she joined them, still glowing with happiness from her wedding day. "Watching both of you discover that the worst thing that ever happened to you was also the door to the best things that followed." The three friends stood together in the garden, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had honored not just love and marriage, but also the triumph of hope over despair, forgiveness over resentment, and friendship over fear. Their story had become a beacon of possibility for anyone struggling to find meaning in suffering, or beauty in brunettes. As they prepared to head home that night, Daniel and Marcus knew that their friendship would continue to be the foundation for work that would help countless others discover that even the most traumatic experiences could become sources of strength, wisdom, and connection when approached with open hearts and willingness to choose love over fear. The accident that had brought them together in pain had become the beginning of a partnership in healing that would touch lives around the world, proving that sometimes the most broken places become the strongest foundations for building something beautiful and meaningful that will last for generations.